Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Apple. I'm a practice manager within Esri's professional services. I manage our state and local government practice. I get the pleasure of working with clients, partners, and Esri teams all around the world on different projects. These are very small things that we're working with clients on to very large multi-year engagements. So before I dive in, I wanted to give you a little bit of context. Why did we create this presentation, or why did Adam recruit me into presenting this one today? One, I have to figure that out because he owes me big time. But the other thing is that a lot of times what we're seeing is that GIS is being underrepresented in organizations. There's great work, great people, and a lot of the things that they're doing becoming unnoticed. And at the same time, we're seeing these terms around transformation and innovation spreading rapidly across organizations. We're seeing a lot of change in government, and technology is moving rapidly. But what we're here to try and help with is best practices regarding the people and process to support those. I will caveat that this is a bit of a work in progress. I think this is something, there's a virtual team, both of members, both at Redlands and our partners also all across the world that are working to better support you as GIS managers. You're probably aware of this, especially if you're sitting in this room, that this is a part of the GIS Managers track. I hope you've been able to check the box on all the others that have been presented earlier this week. I do want to point out two that are coming up this afternoon. One is by my friend Matt Lewin out of Esri, Canada, who's covering governance, and also Wade Kloos, who's going to be covering return on investment. So, show of hands, who out here is seeing some of these trends within your organizations? Some of the ones around innovation or many of these different topics that you're seeing. Show of hands. Great, most everyone, I think. How many of you have, well, let me ask a few other questions. How many of you in the room have a title of data scientist? Okay. Any chief data officers here? Chief innovation officers? Most everyone GIS managers? Okay, great. What was that? Awesome. Great. All right. Yeah, so there's a lot of change happening. I think what we're seeing here is that, there's a lot of government leaders and community representatives are increasingly pushing for what they call organization-wide transformation and this rapid innovation. We're seeing a lot of these new roles come into government, especially focused on these high priority and cross-organizational initiatives. The challenge is, how do we support this change? And what we've tried to deduce it down to is, first of all, you need to understand these emerging patterns, the roles, and the processes in order to be successful. And maybe consider some updated approaches and collaboration techniques. So what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to start out with some of the patterns and trends we've seen, both with technology and organization, and then move into an example of GIS evolution within an organization. Talk a little bit about supporting some of these new roles, and then supporting an updated approach we call the Esri method. So I'll dive in with, first of all, patterns and trends. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think most everyone who saw the plenary can definitely get the feel for where we're headed. But GIS is definitely advancing rapidly. As Jack mentioned, those are in these three realms of data, computing, and innovation. What we find, though, is that a lot of our users are struggling to move from the traditional systems of record, collecting, organizing, managing geospatial information assets, and moving into these systems of engagement or systems of insight. I would say a lot of the agencies that I deal with on a continuous basis are running into some of these. At the same time, we're seeing more interconnected systems of systems. I think if you followed Jack's keynote over the many years, you can see that it's definitely a pattern that we're seeing much more. We also have new emerging products that are here to help with some of this innovation. So in this case, with ArcGIS Hub, being able to share your open data, focus on the initiatives that matter the most to your organization, and create community portals and show performance along those indicators. And you see some of the examples there to the right. From a people side of things, we're also seeing that this requires quite a bit of change within the organization, both with these sort of virtual initiative teams focused on these cross-cutting initiatives you see there in the second wave, and then external partners to the organization, whether it's NGOs, trained volunteers, et cetera, and then the actual community to which the government serves. A lot of times these organizations need a sandbox in order to collaborate together, and that was really the catalyst for ArcGIS Hub. And as ArcGIS Hub has evolved as a product, we in services have also been supporting our approaches to better model how do we engage and help our clients. A little bit also about ArcGIS Urban. We are sort of, Jack didn't have it on his slide, but my take is that we're moving a little bit towards systems of design also. The times of transactional or static transactional plans are sort of moving away to much more interaction, able to evaluate many different scenarios. The other thing too is that what we're seeing is that ArcGIS Urban and ArcGIS Hub are very complementary to each other. So we also have solutions. Jack mentioned this briefly, but I think one thing that I want to hone in here is that we are trying to make these, if you see on the right-hand side of the slide, much more pre-configured so that it makes it easier for you to deploy both the technology, the training around it, and the support for each one. At the same time, GIS systems are becoming easier to manage, monitor, deploy, and automate. So the more I look at, what GIS managers and their staff did maybe, 5, even 10 years ago, a lot of those different types of things are being much more automated now. Whether it's deploying and utilizing cloud or, utilizing ArcGIS Hub for engagement, our Python scripting, even down to ArcGIS Pro, where we have, the concept of workflows and tasks to automate many of the things that traditionally have been very hard and time consuming. Again, we're seeing this distributed collaboration. I can't count the number of times we've been working with clients in the past year, especially it seems to have taken off regarding the systems of systems and distributed servers happening. Again, and at the same time, there's also what's happening next. There's lots of analytics happening with GIS, systems of insights evolving, support for some of these third-party systems and technologies, whether it's R or more advanced Python, exploratory data analysis and visualization, big data, spatial analytics, and even as basic as just being able to create maps. So you get to, okay, Eric, you've just covered the planar array in a really, really quick time. What does that actually mean to me as a GIS manager? To me, it really just means that just as government is evolving and changing, so are the roles and responsibilities of the GIS manager. The systems nowadays are much more approachable. I'm seeing it much more pervasive to a wider range of even non-GIS users within the organization. It's becoming easier to administer and automate. We're seeing much more on exploratory analysis and visualization. Again, I mentioned systems of design. So one interesting thing when I was putting this together the past few months, I started to look at some of the GIS manager job descriptions, and I started to look at one observation was that, one, they don't really match what I see most of the GIS managers doing nowadays. I also don't see them incorporating where technology is headed. And so I think there's going to have to be some retooling as we move forward as a group to support some of these new patterns. So let's talk a little bit about some of the organizational patterns and trends. And I blatantly stole this one from my friend Matt in Esri, Canada. But what we are seeing is that there are some heightened expectations. GIS is definitely moving up the value chain. I would say, again, if it was 10, 15 years ago, I would be looking at the table stakes down there, the foundational value. I'm seeing a lot of things that might have been best practices or utilization in the private sector entering the government sector. So they're using it as a source of advantage, whether it's competing with other counties, other cities, et cetera. And it's being acknowledged at a higher level of the organization also. But what we are seeing is that there are some gaps. And I see this quite a bit actually, and a lot of times help bridge gaps between these. But we are seeing that a lot of the elected leaders, government executives, a lot of times they have very limited awareness of GIS or how it could be applied, time and time again. A lot of times the GIS managers are consumed by their regular departmental work. I think we all here would basically say we have more work than we could ever accomplish at any time. And I think because of that, a lot of times there isn't a seeking out of those policy issues or initiatives. I've had many a GIS manager tell me, yeah, I'm really not going to try to seek out those things that the newly elected mayor is focused on. I think I'll just wait it out. They'll be gone in another 2 to 4 years. So it's a common conversation that I've had around that. At the same time, those elected leaders and government executives are trying to engage the community, but they're doing it in fits and starts, we call it, and they're not capturing the valuable input. If you really look at, there's large amounts of community groups. There are people who want to help change. They want to help make their community better, but I think it's hard knowing how to engage them. The community is not as aware as they could be and not maximizing the potential to help the causes that matter to them. The other thing is, a lot of times we see is that the realities are elected leaders are promoting transformation and innovation. They promise results to people who put them into their positions. A lot of shaking hands and kissing babies. So the other thing is that the realities are they have at best and moderate to at worst little control over said promises being actualized. And what I mean by that is, what they really worry about is, will I really be able to fulfill the promises or I'll lose credibility with the people? And the second one there, how do I get, Karen in Public Works to execute on the things I promised? So these are things I've heard quite a lot. And then I've had, a lot of departments tell us, oh, no, they're asking for us to do this now. The executive's asking, how do I do more? How do I motivate my departments and focus on what I want them to focus on? The other thing or other pattern that we've seen is that there's a movement, and you'll notice I put a plus here and not an arrow, because I don't think it's either or. I've seen quite a lot of the traditional hierarchical management structures in place, but then there's more of a sort of behind the curtains or another layer of structure that's been happening too, and they're organized around initiatives. So you can think of them as virtual teams that come together and rally around a particular cause. Again, there are these changing patterns, changing roles. In some cases too, many of the systems that you have are being outsourced to external providers, for example. Again, not always hierarchical, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later. So let's look at an example of GIS evolution. This example is very similar to what we see in a lot of organizations, and I'll stop in a minute and see if you think this is on spot or on point. If I dial back pretty much any organization, there was usually one GIS person who came in and basically kicked ass. I mean, the person just did some great work. It got acknowledged. They were doing analysis. This person was passionate about it. They basically built momentum. That momentum eventually grew. So additional users were formed, and maybe grew into some other departments. In some cases you saw, for example, over in the police department, you maybe had some other, like a GIS analyst who learned about GIS and moved forward with it. As we evolve, what we see is that GIS becomes a little more maybe centralized or maybe moving toward enterprise GIS. We have the GIS manager and the positions moving maybe over to information technology, but not always. Sometimes it's in one of the departments, the lead department. We see a GIS working group that gets evolved, and we see the community. But the community in this case typically is a push to the community. There's not a pull. It's just a push out. Maybe there's a big website where you've put every tool and every map conceivable out there and hope that the community can navigate it. If we move forward, we see expansion. All I've really added here is that there's more users. And then let me pause for a second. Does that somewhat represent a lot of the agencies? Show of hands, yes, no, okay. And then we get to sort of what I'm seeing right now. And what I see right now, and I'll try to break these down for you, maybe I'll start with the orange line. What I'm seeing is that there's these cross-cutting organization-wide initiatives, and in this case, a more livable community. There are goals and aspirations for the organization. And we're seeing that there are these internal and external teams that are needing to be created that are focused on addressing that top-level organizational mission or objective. We're seeing some new roles that are added: Chief X Officer, Data Scientist, other, Chief Resiliency Officer, the list goes on. We're also seeing some of those roles embedded into some of the departments, as I've articulated here in economic development. We're also seeing much more awareness from city council, city managers of what GIS can do. And then on the top right with the community, we're seeing not just a push, but the community is at a seat at the table around that particular initiative. And so if I take a step back and I look at it as a GIS manager, it's like, this is a lot, right? There's a lot of new demands on us that we didn't have even just a few years ago. So how do we support these changes? And I'm going to take a stab at it today. I'll mention what I said earlier. This is a bit of a work in progress, and I think we'd love to hear from everyone here how we can do better in some of the things that you're seeing. For today, I broke it down into a couple of different categories. The first being supporting these new roles. And just last night, I had someone mention to me and says, I don't worry about those people. Those people they'll be gone in a year. They're doing their stint here. The thing I want you to remember is, there's a reason those positions are created. It may be a perceived or it may be an actual void in the organization. And so, take a step and maybe think about that. I also recently spoke to a CIO for a state here in the United States, and she said, if they're hiring those roles, you as a CIO have an issue. There's a void. Something was missing. And I sensed some friction between some of these new roles, even with the CIO, and in this case, it was around Chief Innovation Officers. So first, let's talk about the characteristics of some of these. And I think, in order to understand how we work with these folks, we have to understand sort of what their mantra is or why they're being brought in. The data scientists that I've worked with, a lot of times they're very familiar with a common set of tools. A lot of them are not geospatial tools that you're typically familiar with or I'm typically familiar with. They definitely come from a scientist type or science background. Most of the time I've experienced, they are definitely not familiar with the organization's resources. They're not familiar with GIS. They're not familiar with the licensing you have, the subject matter expertise or resources. And sometimes I see a lot of duplicative efforts. I've seen, a mayor bring in a data scientist and say, hey, help me figure this out. They create a beautiful map, and it happens to be the map that the GIS analyst did 5 years ago, but nobody saw it because it was on their desk or it wasn't, publicized. A lot of times I've seen also these folks need help with best practices and documenting their work. So leads me to this. This is basically what a lot of these agencies are looking for. They're looking for the data scientist unicorn. You'll find this term quite a bit. And what that basically means is that, they're able to do the technical parts as well as communicate recommendations and results to decision makers. And, I see that quite a bit. I mean, a lot of times the data scientists, they understand the science, they understand the math behind the analysis that they're doing, but they're also extremely good at articulating what that means. And I think that's what they mean by the data scientist unicorn, is it's a very hard, like if I go back to the other slide that I have, if you look at all the skills in that graphic there, that's a lot, right? Because of that, these folks are very much in demand. I see quite a few of these where they're doing a, quote, a stint in government. A lot of times they're focused on different causes. It might be like a social inequity cause. And they have a mandate to show results quickly. They are typically at a very different cadence than we all operate. A lot of times they're very much tied to the cadence of an elected official, which is a lot of times, let's say, a 4-year window of showing change. And another thing here, and we'll get to this in a little bit when you talk about technology, I think they definitely understand the math. So I've seen on some of the projects where we've had like AI and some of the other sort of newer technologies that we have, they quickly get the back end of the, what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about Chief Innovation Officer. And this is a very difficult position. I've encountered quite a few that I don't know that I'd want the job. It's very, very hard. They're brought in to lead innovation, to do it faster, more consistently, and better support cross-cutting government initiatives. A lot of times we see this role evolving from the Chief Data Officer. A lot of times they're typically not well defined, their roles. They're being asked to come in and create a culture of innovation, which is, that's a pretty insane request of anyone, I think. The best ones that we've seen are able to create innovators, not just do innovation. In other words, they're institutionalizing the skills and the business units of the departments of the organization and standalone innovation groups. So what they do is by taking on different types of projects to do innovation, they grow organically. So I like the quote down there, you're hiring a detective, a curious problem solver. And I've seen quite a few of that. It's turn over every stone, and sometimes it's pretty disruptive to the organization. Departments don't like it a lot of times, and it can cause a bit of friction. Chief Data Officer. Typically what I've seen here is that they're responsible for the organization-wide data governance and information as an asset. They sometimes evolve from the GIS manager GIO roles. They aren't always aware of GIS existing data repositories. A lot of times they've now moved into things like managing open data initiatives and performance or KPI indicators. And the newer trends are to evolve into the Chief Analytics Officer. The other role that you don't hear a lot about, but that I see more of nowadays, is that the internal champions or change agents. Who are these people? Who are these rock stars that are within your organization that are excited about the organization's new initiatives? They may not have a title. They might not have, they may be new to the organization. They may have a cause of their own that they would like to latch onto. But, they want to typically take action and make change. They're familiar with and willing to learn GIS. They're tenacious, and enable cross-departmental collaboration. So a few tips for working with these folks. And I know the first one sounds probably stupid and minimal, but I've talked to the Chief Innovation and Analytics Officer for New York City, LA, many other cities. And one of the key things is going to lunch and getting to know these people. You have a lot in common with these individuals. And we as Esri, because we've worked with a lot of the departments, we have done a lot of introductions. We've had the Chief Data Officer reach out to us and say, hey, who do I talk to about data? I know you, Esri, blah, 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 blah. And then we do connections a lot of times. But, we shouldn't have to do that. I think you guys should be able to do that too. A few other recommendations: share your data internally and externally. It's some of the most valuable in the organization. Share your Esri technology. Most every one of these roles I just went over, they don't know Esri technology, both the fundamentals of it and even some of the more advanced things. I can guarantee the data scientist doesn't know about the advanced analytics that Jack had on the plenary and how to work with R, or how the new Python scripting works, or et cetera. The other thing is, and I'll talk about this in the process in just a little bit, is find and collaborate on a cross-cutting organization initiative together. Create that virtual team, rally around a cause, give a team a purpose, and use the success of that, because it will get visibility, because it's one of the cross-cutting high-level initiatives of the organization. Use that success to extend the value of GIS within your organization. Top bullet here, I also see quite a bit of, is don't be a gatekeeper or adopt a not created here mindset. And I think it's, I'll just sort of go off a little bit of a tangent here, but it's, GIS as a career and a career path, there's been a lot of clawing our way to make it a legitimate thing within government, right? And sometimes I see it as, oh, they're doing mapping, but I'm the GIS professional. And I think that not created here mindset really sort of restricts or constricts our ability to expand it and make it more valuable to the organization. I just see that quite a lot. The other, as I mentioned earlier, updating your position descriptions, retooling your teams, et cetera. The other is embrace and enable non-GIS professionals. Those change agents I mentioned, it's amazing what they can do. I mean, and what I've seen the GIS professional role sort of migrate to now is enablement, enabling the organization, providing best practices. A lot of times I see, for example, a data scientist might create a story map for the mayor's office, and then the GIS professional or the GIS manager basically freaks out. You don't know about the data, or you don't know about how to cartographically represent this. And my response to that is, you should be at the table with them, helping them, and I know everyone has a lot on their plate, but I think, if you can start to enable some of these change agents, you can start to build momentum in your organization, and eventually, my experience has been that things become better for the GIS professionals and GIS managers. So let's talk a little bit about the second area I recommend, which is supporting an updated approach. I'm going to use a case study for this. So at Esri, we've created what we call the Esri method. The approach is a high-level approach any organization can follow to maximize the impact of GIS. It's definitely focused on incremental successes and aligns the technical accomplishments with the organizational vision. The place I've seen it most useful is in these transformational or innovation-focused organizations, and it actually came out of some work we've done with some clients about 2 years ago, and it evolved from there. Those were around ArcGIS Hub and Smart City type projects. I'm going to give an abbreviated version of this. I do recommend this afternoon there's a session where they spend the full hour going through the Esri method. That's this afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30, presented by my friend Anna Sokol and others. So let's break this down as regarding the Esri method, and I've found it to be very useful again on these types of working with organizations as a framework to use to move forward. So what it starts out with is identifying what is the location strategy, what is the business vision, what's the organizational mission, what's the bold vision. For example, in Minneapolis, they have a mission statement which is to create a growing and vibrant world-class city with a flourishing economy and pristine environment where all people are safe, healthy, and have equitable opportunities for success and happiness. Okay, it's great. So what does success look like? And I mean toward that bold vision, not individual project success at a mission level. Does the organization or your organization always define success beforehand, on innovation-focused initiatives? Sometimes it's not always clear. Sometimes you don't even know. Sometimes it's exploratory. But you need to be able to define that up front. From a people side, what are the top business drivers to your organization? There's a focus on the business side, not the technology side. Most critical are the right people, having a champion. The only way I've found these to be successful is to have a champion, executive sponsor, and the right technical leadership, and those people all at the table, along with GIS at the table. But without the champion, most of these I've seen have failed. You don't hire a chief innovation officer or a data scientist without a champion or someone with a cause that can help team with that team. And you also need the right mindset. Focus on the business outcomes. Focus on quick wins. What can we accomplish very quickly? These folks and the team that works on it has to be okay with some uncertainty. Typically, there's a configuration first approach versus okay, this is going to take a year and this is a big old project. It's hard for mayors to get excited about that kind of thing, right? Have to be very flexible and adaptable. The next I'm going to go into is the roadmap. So the roadmap gets into the people, the process, and the tech. You need to know where you are in order to know where you have capability to go. So how is GIS currently solving these problems? It's been funny. Sometimes I've had accounts or clients where, the mayor says, "Hey, I'd love to be able to showcase that, what we're doing on paving of new streets." And a lot of times that map has already been created, the data's already been created. It's just basically repurposing it and pointing it in a different direction within your organization to these people who are working on innovation. Identifying the priority workflows, identifying where you're at with your technology, your data, your applications, your infrastructure, your people. And then from a workforce capability, what's your human capital? Again, don't think of it just as your GIS professionals. Think of those other people that I mentioned earlier. How can they work with you to help you and you guys work together? So what comes out of this are prioritized initiatives. And I know you're probably thinking, okay, what the heck is that? How do I go from these big vision, like the Minneapolis mission statement, to something I can actually do, right? So I'm going to take a case study. This is the city of Los Angeles. We do a lot of work with the city and had a new mayor. If you were at the plenary a couple of years ago, you probably saw Lillian Corral, who presented on the city. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of behind the scenes of what was happening on that one. But mayor brought in a mission, transform the city of Los Angeles, and that was in many different ways. The mayor my machine's being slow. So the city and the mayor defined these bold aspirations, to be safe, well-run, livable, healthy, prosperous, and sustainable. These are the core values of the organization. But simply saying we need to be more livable is too vague. To get the momentum the city needs, they needed to make change happen. That's, it's very hard if you have these very high level goals. Let's see here. And then those are mapped over to actionable initiatives, breaking the aspirations down to results in initiatives. For example, improve emergency response times, use less energy, make parking easier, create more affordable housing. These are a bit more manageable and specific. You can track these and see if progress is being made, although a lot of these are still very complex, enough that they can be broken down another level or two into, for example, SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. So the city of Los Angeles, one of the things that they focused on is setting this organization-wide strategy. So to achieve these goals, they said, government and the community need to be informed, they need to be on board, they need to participate, contribute data, contribute ideas, align efforts, align resources, in order to break down the silos within the organization and sort of rally around a common cause. So what we did is we actually had multiple of these happening at the same time, but in this case, we took the organizational goal of creating a more livable city, and we did a workshop. Okay, how do you get to that point? In this case, it was, let's prioritize the initiatives to reach those goals. So one was reduce traffic congestion, and you'll see the list goes on. We probably had 20 to 40. One thing you'll notice in most all of these is that ideas are easy. The hard part is finding the ones you can actually do quickly. And so we identified reduced traffic congestion as being one of the first ones they wanted to focus on. And so from there, we went into an initiative cycle. And an initiative cycle, you see here the 4 steps, cover plan, implementation, operate, and review. And I'm going to go through those, but it's worth pointing out that most of the time, there are multiple initiatives happening at the same time, and some of them can be at the different stages together. All of these, I usually call or use the term, I'm stitching together these common patterns of GIS, and I'm finding templates, or I'm finding the Esri tools that can accomplish them. These are the fundamental characteristics of an initiative. So let's talk about the first plan. So in the plan, and at this case, I'm talking about a specific initiative, not like before when I was talking about the big picture. So in the plan, we're definitely talking about what can give us quick wins, what can provide immediate impact. And when I say quick wins, there's sometimes quick wins as in like by the end of the day, sometimes by the end of the week, not quick wins as in a month, and definitely not like 6 months to a year. The ones that provide immediate impact have actual real users, low risk, have a clear success criteria. From a design perspective, which ones can I use common deployment patterns on? In other words, lower risk from a technology perspective. And then, as I mentioned earlier, where you've assessed your architecture, determining what architectural challenges or things would be needed. And on the people side of things, being able to prepare staff and deal with change management. So from a City of Los Angeles perspective, we took it to the next step, which is, okay, I've got reduced traffic congestion. Where can location potentially help me? Right? So we went through an exercise. We have a term we call a location value assessment, where you find how location can provide value in these things that are being discussed. And in this case, we came up with what we call them information products. But an information product could be a map, it could be story map, many different things. But just think of an information product as a thing that addresses one of the initiatives. And we came up with many that could help with reduced traffic congestion. And then we went through a process of where do we start? And we analyzed the value, the risk, and priority. So in this case, we looked at, where does it fall? And the one that the couple that we came with are the ones in the top right. They're the ones with the lower risk, the higher value, but we didn't want to throw away all the great ideas that had been evolved. So, some of those came into the plan, so they're sort of sitting there in a pool, and in the next sprint, we'll pull those off the shelf and continue moving forward. But for the immediate, we focused on quick wins. In the implementation side, we took those and we went through an exercise. So for the one I was mentioning around reducing traffic congestion, we looked at, are there any off-the-shelf templates that we can use? Can we utilize our existing GIS data? Can we utilize our existing ArcGIS Online infrastructure? And so the goal there was to demonstrate value really quickly, and then share those results. I can't emphasize enough the right-hand column here, the enable. As I was mentioning earlier, a lot of times GIS and what we do is very valuable, but it doesn't get shared. It doesn't get mapped to something that can excite the community or help even with increasing staff capacity, because you've had this excitement and others have recognized it. Celebrating success, we rarely do that also. And most importantly, articulating the business value. So what LA came up with to address that one thread that I was going through, one of their initiatives, was Streetwise, and a little back end of about Streetwise. So the city basically said, look, we want to reduce traffic congestion. We want to let people know what's happening in their right-of-way, basically their drive to school or their drive to work. What's happening right now? Why are they digging up my streets? And what's going to be happening in the future? And so one of the things that we realized after going through some of their data, because they had registered 500 data layers in their open data portal, and at least 3 of their departments, one of those being Bureau of Engineering, is that any planning permit that comes into the city, they already capture a point. They know a date and a time of where it's going to happen. They already had a database, and there were 2 people that looked at that, 2 engineers. Nobody else knew that that data even existed. We were working with the chief data officer. We ran a meeting, all of a sudden discovered it was there, and then said, okay, well, that's achievable. It's actually pretty low risk. The data's already being created, but it's not being pushed out to the public. It's not addressing one of the initiatives. And so from a back end, it was one of the quick wins. It was easy to achieve. So the city then had a launch, and you'll notice in the top right, they had many different initiatives when they launched. They created a website. Going back to my slide earlier, they were essentially trying to excite people. They were trying to share their results. They were trying to celebrate their success. And one thing you'll notice from this slide here is that originally they only had 3 departments who were really on board with this. There were a lot of naysayers. And this was one of those, you start to build it and then they'll come type thing. Again, the city had different press that they did, different events that they did across the city. Some of those were as simple as on the courthouse steps and a news person there, or it was as simple as a tweet that went out from the mayor's office that had a story map. But they learned from what they did. And the one thing I wanted you to take away from here is that as they went through this, they continued to evolve. And to this day, they continue to evolve. And they sometimes go forward, they sometimes go backwards. And I think, that's the point of going through these initiative cycles, is you learn from each cycle of doing the initiative. You have to be very flexible, adventurous, and energetic. Use Esri best practices and take an incremental approach. But when you get to that point, you're all done, right? Right? Kick back. Yep, we did it. It's awesome, right? Mayor was on the stage. No, we can't do that. We're GIS managers. So you get into the operate phase. So on the operate phase, then you need to monitor. So you need to do things like, okay, well, the mayor tweeted about this story map. What's that doing to my server, right? Oh, okay, well, maybe I need to move that data over to online and make it a little more elastic. So you learn from that. You learned what the users liked. You learned what other people liked. More than likely, other people saw what you did and they've started to approach you about it. You started to measure, your utilization, things of that nature. And you're starting to create these virtual groups and support them. We've had some clients who create their own GeoNet communities and all around a given initiative. You need to start looking at considering the next ArcGIS release, what that means, ongoing learning for support. And then lastly, reviewing where you're at. Are you meeting the business objectives? Go back to that very beginning where you had the vision for the organization and where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish. Has the destination changed? A lot of times it changes continuously, and sometimes it can change based on the local news and what they reported on last week. So this is definitely a dynamic thing, and I think what I see is, because it's so dynamic, a lot of times GS managers and GS professionals, because they are a lot of times just struggling to keep the lights on and keep the systems running, they're not seeking these out. So they're afraid of doing these and afraid of going through this process. But what I've found is, if you're willing to take that first leap and do a couple of these and get the visibility, all of a sudden there's definitely a recognition of the value of GIS in the organization that goes to the highest and top levels of the organization. You also start finding people who start to seek you out. I think what I found with LA is a lot of those naysayers originally, they basically later on added, they've forgotten how many departments now share data and are doing some of this with them, but they definitely have created momentum and excitement. And so with that, you can start to enable other people within the organization. So if you look here, like in the workforce, and I think the presenter before me was talking a little bit about that too, is, evolve your human capital, those roles, et cetera. Tips and resources, document your business outcomes, get the executives to promote the success, and then again, prepare for the next initiative. And I think I skipped my in summary slide. Go back here. Yeah. So in summary, understand the trends, understand the new roles, adopt a new process as my machine gradually dies a long death. So it's been a long week on my machine, I think, this week at user conference. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or anything I can help with. See if this is what you had in mind, or if there are areas we can cover further. But show of hands, is this on point with what you're seeing in your organizations now? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.